accept information theory. Um, and I really like the modern development of information entropy, that entropy might be about information. I think it's a truly spiritual, every once in a while, there's a spiritual like discovery. And the scientists of the day aren't necessarily getting it. Some of them, no doubt, are, but maybe they're not putting it in the science literature. They might, a lot of times, even be keeping away from that conclusion about their discovery. But a great thing about the quantum computational guys and how they're kind of taking over quantum theory is that, okay, so the universe really is a quantum computer. It might be computing random numbers into other random numbers, but whatever. It's doing computation. And this has led to this idea that um, entropy is really about information, and that you have information which is, for example, knowable things, things that have been figured out that because you have interacted with them, right? So they've happened to you, so that's information. They've happened to the neural system, they've happened to a rock, they've interacted, it's committed to being that way. Whereas entropy is unknown information, potentially knowable information. And the interesting thing is that you want to talk about things that fit together. If you have a chamber, a classic chamber in thermodynamics where it's hot, and you don't really know where the particles are, what the state of the system is, and so that it's high in entropy. If you put a thermometer in there and it heats the thermometer up, and you pull it out, and you get information about the temperature, you actually will lower the entropy in there. You will take entropy out. Taking entropy out of an unknown situation, getting information rather from an unknown situation, reduces its entropy. And in that example, it would actually reduce the temperature in the classical sense, and its entropy would be lowered. So I accept information theory, and this is the most abstract of these items that I'll offer as spiritually important. I think it's important to accept, the laws of statistics that say you can only know something plus or minus, and if you have one example, you don't even know what the plus or minus is. You have 1,000 versus this. You could start to estimate what the fuzzy boundary of your knowledge is. But there's always a fuzzy boundary to your knowledge. It is spiritually unhealthy to try to eliminate entirely that fuzzy boundary. But don't worry, because you can still navigate accurately enough to make it to the moon and do all kinds of amazing things that are only 99.999% certain. You know, that's good enough. But just don't go for that 100%, please. That's spiritually unhealthy. That's what I would say to my fellow travelers in spirituality. And that's my concern when I run into people that are pursuing spiritual paths, like myself. Okay, so finally, I have made a study not just of science in my life, but of the mistakes of mankind, the mistakes in our reasoning. I've always found it interesting. The world, people supposedly thought the world is flat. I don't think I ever would have thought that. It looks kind of bumpy to me. Um, Still, the fact that it's a sphere is pretty amazing. Um, I'm still in touch with this as if a child, in the sense that I can look in that direction and think, if I go in that direction far enough, I am going to come up behind me. That's pretty amazing to me still. Now, I understand why it works out that way just as well as everybody else, but I find society uh, is a little bit too nonchalant, or dare I say glib, about that knowledge. They're not really considering it, kind of like the sunrise. They know the Earth's spinning, but they think of it as a sunrise, but they tell themselves, no, I'm a modern human, I know the Earth's spinning. But they think of it, they feel it as a sunrise. And me, I've maintained a sense of wonder about that. Um, you mentioned, this is just my miscellany to finish up with, you mentioned about rejecting dogma a lot. I appreciate that. especially in the sense, the more broad sense that I've had to overcome a lot of things. And when I was younger, I used to think, well, to have a good philosophy, I need to apply it. And then if I apply it, it makes my life great, then that'll prove it. And that's a bad way to prove a philosophy. And yet, to think it's a bad way to prove a philosophy could just be an excuse for the fact that you can't point to a, yay, look, I got rich. So, but I really do believe it's a bad way to prove a philosophy. I don't think you can prove the viability of your ideas through a successful life. And Einstein, who was a pretty great thinker and a pretty decent person too, if you read his biography, you'll see yet another example of not a saint. Okay, not for everybody that he interacted with. Maybe not for his children, not for various things, depending what your own value system is. But I think it's great that you've overcome these dogmas. But I believe that that's a perpetual process. And I think the caution I would give to you is that to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm not. You are still seeking answers when what we need for a spiritual path that we're going to share with others, because the spiritual path is personal, right? But you're out here sharing spiritual information as spiritual path, and I too sometimes share that information, though I do so with more caution than you. Um, I think the shared spiritual message has to um, it has to it has to incorporate accepting information. I see you as as coming up with answers. Answers don't absorb information, right? They're an attempt to radiate information. And it's good, but answers are temporary. The information should radiate off and turn into a question. So basically, we need to create new questions, new ways to absorb information. That's what I think is the greater spiritual path. But maybe that's a personal thing. That's what I found on my spiritual path. Um, and I think you're not accepting, and with what you described as your scientific background, now you have to remember biology is a particular kind of a science, and only some people want to dissect cats and things, and deal with goo. And it's different than like my experience with scientists, working with scientists is astronomers, and they're not perfect either, but it's definitely, you shouldn't generalize too much about the kind of scientists that you worked with or were trained to be. But in either case, with any of the sciences, you should be able to absorb the good data. First of all, that's an absolute, as close to an absolute as a relativist and a skeptic like me could get. I might as well use the word absolute. There's good data in there. And a little bit harder, but for me, a spiritual realization is that there's good interpretations too, right? There's good interpretations too. I mean, the idea that tell me the positions and angles of velocity, the vectors of velocity of all the particles, and I'll tell you the future. Well, I think that's going too far. That's not a good interpretation. But there's a lot of other interpretations um, that we really should try to absorb. We should have questions that those old interpretations are still allowed to at least partially answer. And in that way, we iteratively have a chance of making spiritual progress. Because if we're supposed to teleport to the final destination, well, I could go back to, you know, what I think, what I have found personally that I have to admit to have spiritual health in my own life, which is to say, in order to have spiritual feelings about that drive me to positive action. Um, The scientific method, I'm not even sure anymore I want to talk about that to people, because I mean the scientific method involves many things, and the most restricting of those things is to measure only mass, distance, and time. And it's an open question whether everything resolves to that. And I believe in a natural philosophy, and I've often used the word science as a synonym for natural philosophy. But natural philosophy is about being open to all the data we get, and feelings of love and feelings of spirituality and so on and so forth are a part of that data. And yet, there is no way at the moment to measure spirituality in terms of its mass, distance, and velocity, mass, distance, and time, except maybe metaphorically. And while that's fun, I mean, I wouldn't want to claim that captures the phenomena. And since it is a distinct feeling, I think we should take it as we get it, right? So I'm more inclined to defend the process of natural philosophy, but I'm not inclined to abandon science, the good data that we have gotten from it, which all comes through our human senses. I mean, a Geiger counter goes click, 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 click. The real information we're getting is sound, right? So, at least in the classic one, you can see the rads on there too. But we're getting these things through our vision and our ears, and in some cases, chemists use taste and touch, and texture. So, um, I don't believe that the scientific method at all implies a rigid or any particular sense of self. Einstein seemed to have a very fluid sense of self, so that he could imagine himself as a light beam and stuff. I think that shows a pretty flexible sense of self in his individual case, and I don't think you'd say he was non-scientific, and yet he was very, very different from a Feynman or a Newton, or Newton, who had what we would consider a classical sense of self now, but it wasn't classical at the time. At the time, it was different. So I think one of the things that scientists do, at least physical scientists and maybe biologists are different, is that they actually have a wide variety of rather well, even odd senses of self, to be honest. So in general, science, as we understand it, and certainly natural philosophy, generates a continually changing sense of self. Um, and well, I think something to absorb on this is Kuhn's, book, the Copernic. What is it titled exactly? The Copernican Revolution, I think, um, which is all about how the global sense of self changed from the Copernican Revolution. And I think he makes a good point, though a not absolutely solid one, but still a very, very good one. Um, so, there is this guy, Piro of Elis, that I named myself after, as far as my internet name or handle. And that's the more broad version of the scientific method. And he basically just said we should assent to what appears to be the case. How you determine what appears to be the case is somewhat open. The methodology is somewhat open, but it has something to do with looking to our stream of perceptions, which I say is looking to nature. That's all we get from nature. And there's noise in there, and that's the statistical information, um, you know, science, right? Is that yeah? There's noise in every signal. That's the whole entropy thing. There's noise in every signal. You can lower the noise down so that it's really, really quiet compared to the signal, and good for you. On the other hand, you can only do that with a high volume of information. If you get just a tiny little packet of information, it may or may not have a lot of noise, and you won't know. You'll need a lot of information to be relatively sure you've got the noise down to some percentage, and there's always a fluke chance that you're off. But you can use time to sort of resolve and iron out that and handle it. And so, yeah, I don't think you're crazy. Cheers.